Now I just want to go through just a real quick bio of your congressman, Congressman Jim Bridenstine. Congressman Bridenstine is a graduate of Jenks High School. He's a graduate of Rice University with a triple major from Rice in economics, business, and psychology. Congressman Bridenstine is a Navy pilot. He's fought both in Iraq and Afghanistan, which gives him, I think, a unique perspective on what's happening in the world right now. So without further ado, if you could, please help me welcome Congressman Jim Bridenstine to the stage.
Thank you. Okay, stay here for a second. Wow. Wow. I guess some people wanted to come to a town hall. This is incredible. And boy, I'll tell you, I am pleased. Very, very pleased. I just want everybody here, if you will. One of the amazing things that happened to me when I was the executive director of the Tulsa Air and Space Museum is I met this guy. And I hired him to be my marketing director. And when I ran for Congress, I asked him to help me get elected. And I've asked him to be my district director. And for those who don't know how difficult that job is, let me tell you, you guys don't make it easy on him. And I just want to say how grateful I am to Gabe Sherman for the amazing work he does for the 1st District of Oklahoma. Please give him a round of applause. Thank you. Is everybody able to hear me with this mic that I have on my tie? If you can't, would you raise your hand? I guess you wouldn't raise your hand. How about this? Would you raise your hand if you can hear me in the back? There you go. So people can hear me. That's good. One other great thing that happened to me when I was the executive director of the Tulsa Air and Space Museum is I came into contact with a group called the Tulsa Praise Orchestra. And you have just been enjoying their music. We did an event, yes. We did an event in October, I think it was October of 2009 maybe. And we had an event where we had a bunch of military aircraft, World War II aircraft, vintage war-fighting airplanes. And we did a big event, and at this event, we had the Tulsa Praise Orchestra on a stage, and they were playing patriotic music with the American hero aircraft flying by. And it was amazing until the temperature dropped below 40 degrees. And they were out there trying to tune their instruments in some of the coldest weather you can possibly imagine, but they stayed the entire time, and they did an amazing job. And I got to know them, and certainly I've been participating in a lot of their events. They do great work. And later tonight, we're going to have the opportunity to hear them once again. We're going to have somebody come up that many people in this room probably are familiar with. Her name is Ernestine Dillard. And she is a nationally recognized recording artist. And she's going to close us out tonight when we're done with the town hall. But what an honor it is to be here. What an honor it is to have so many people want to come to a town hall. And I can tell you, I can imagine why that is. Our country is in peril, quite frankly. And I don't mince words about it. We have challenges that are domestic, and we have challenges that are national and international. And as it relates to some of the domestic issues, and we're going to go to questions here pretty soon, as Gabe mentioned, but domestically, we have a lot of challenges as well. When you think about our country now for 5 years in a row, having a deficit of over $1 trillion, and this year the deficit is going to come down a little bit. That is true. It's going to come down because we had a tax increase at the end of 2012. And of course, we're living under the sequester now. And because of that, we're going to have a temporary lull in the deficit. But we will still have the 6th highest deficit in American history. And if you look at the tables, the deficit is coming right back. And nobody questions that. And here's what's driving it. I'm going to be very brutally honest. Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. These three programs alone will bankrupt our country if politicians are not willing to do what is required and shore them up for the future. Now, here's the reality. If we don't, our country will simply cease to exist. Let me share with you where we are as a nation right now economically. When we have trillion-dollar deficits, we literally right now we have been for years creating money out of thin air, taking that newly created money and buying the newly created treasury bonds to finance our government. When you have a trillion-dollar deficit, we have to finance that. We sell bonds. The Treasury Department sells bonds. The question is, who buys those bonds? It used to be the American citizens, foreign sovereigns. It used to be institutional, purchasers of these bonds. For a period of time, 80% of those bonds were being purchased with newly printed money from the Federal Reserve. So they create the money out of thin air. They take the newly created money, they buy the newly created bonds, and voila, you can fund the government. When you do this, you create enormous amounts of liquidity as a percentage of our GDP, which is exactly what has been happening in our country. Tremendous amounts of liquidity. And with that should come inflation. It is the natural occurrence from creating all of this liquidity. And I hear from my friends on the other side of the aisle, where is the inflation? We need to continue. We need to have another stimulus package. They're calling for $300 billion of new spending. And they want us to print money even faster to stimulate the economy. Friends, if this continues to happen, the liquidity only grows. And there's going to come a day when all of this liquidity comes into the markets. Right now, you're not seeing it. People say, why? Right now in this country, we are at a 50-year low velocity of money. What this means is that the money is not circulating through the economy. Businesses are not borrowing. And I'm telling you, I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room maybe that own businesses that have fewer than 50 employees. And you're doing everything you can to make sure you don't go above 50 because it'll put you in a new regulatory environment as it relates to Obamacare. That's happening. I talk to businesses in this district all the time, and they're having this issue. It's happening right now. Businesses are not borrowing. They are disincentivized from growing. And as a result, in fact, some businesses are saying, we're going to cut our employees. We're at 57. We got to get down to 49, and we're going to make that happen. The incentive is backwards. Banks are not lending. They're not lending because of Dodd-Frank, the bank examiners, the concerns that they might give a loan to a wrong person, they could default, and then the regulators come down on them. And because banks have not been lending and businesses have not been borrowing, the money has not been circulating. We're at a 50-year low for velocity. For a while, we, individuals, were deleveraging. Instead of borrowing, we were deleveraging, which again slowed the velocity of the money. And so liquidity has been created. Everybody says they want to see the economy turn around. I want to see the economy turn around as well. But when all of this liquidity comes into the markets, you will see massive amounts of inflation. And by the way, we've been here before. This isn't new. It's something that we have done before as a nation, and it's something that we have already done to ourselves now. You go back to the 1970s. Some of you in this room may have bought a house in the 1970s. My parents bought a house in the 1970s. They paid 21% interest. If you would, just raise your hand if that may have happened to you. High teens, maybe. Friends, this is where we're going back to because of the liquidity that has been created. And interestingly, when the interest rate, let me hold up for 1 second. When you think about this inflation rate, how does that relate to interest rates and buying a home at 21% interest? And I'll back up here for a second. When the inflation occurs, because of all the liquidity that's been created, there's going to come a time when the Federal Reserve says, look, we got to hold down inflation because this is damaging people. Who does inflation damage? It damages the poor. It damages seniors on fixed income. Friends, there are people who have lived their entire lives appropriately. They have saved for their futures. And now they come to the point where it's time to retire, and they're on a fixed income, and the price of toilet paper is going up. The price of food is going up. The price of gasoline, the price of housing. The components that make up the biggest parts of our personal budgets, all of those prices have gone up. And they're going to continue to go up because of the liquidity that has been created. There are seniors in this room, no doubt, that are feeling the crunch right now. I talk to people in this district that are coming out of retirement. I talk to people in this district that want to retire, and they're saying, look, we just can't do it because things aren't the same. Interest rates are artificially low. Inflation, why are interest rates so low, by the way? If you've lived your whole life appropriately, you get to the end of your career and you retire, and you can only get a 3% return on investment. Why is that? Well, when you have this bond buying program where you create the money out of thin air and you buy the bonds, you drive up the price of those bonds. The yields shrink. Lower interest rates are reflected throughout the markets. So in the treasury bonds, you drive up the price of the bonds, you drive down the interest rates, those interest rates are reflected throughout the markets. People are coming to the end of their careers, it's time to retire, and they're saying, look, I'm stuck. At 3 or 4% interest, which is what I need for security, because I want to have a low-risk investment, I can't retire. And this isn't the way it was supposed to be. But your government has given you this economy because we have trillion-dollar deficits. And we have to print the money to buy the bonds, to fund the government, artificially driving the price of bonds up, driving the interest rates down. Seniors are being squeezed on the prices, and they're being squeezed on their fixed income at the same time. And by the way, who does this hurt the most? The poor, who spend the biggest parts of their budget on gasoline and on food and on housing. It's happening in our country right now, and there's going to come a day when the economy does heat up, and all of this liquidity that's been created is going to come into the markets and prices are going to go up. And by the way, they're already going up. If you shop at the grocery store, I am convinced that nobody on the other side of the aisle from me shops at the grocery store. I'm convinced of that because they all tell me that there's no inflation. But the reality is, people in this room obviously have felt the pinch. And when this economy starts heating up and the money comes in and the prices go up, the Federal Reserve has an option. They got to start selling the bonds that they've been buying. So they've been buying the bonds to finance the government with newly created money. Now they've got a whole vat of bonds. And in order to hold down inflation, to get the greenbacks out of the market, to get the dollars out of the market, they're going to have to sell those bonds. So they put all those bonds on the market. They get the greenbacks out of the market. That holds down inflation. Fantastic. But now there's an oversupply of bonds on the market, which means, the price of bonds goes down, interest rates go up. High inflation, high interest rates at the same time. I am confident there are people in this room that remember the 1970s. There's a difference between the 1970s and today. There's a big difference. In the 1970s, your country didn't have a $17 trillion debt. 10% of what we spend as a nation is service on the national debt. It's the interest payments. And the interest payments right now are around 3 to 4%. Imagine a day when interest rates are at 6%. Now, instead of 10% of federal spending, it's 20% of federal spending. What are you going to cut? And when I talk about interest rates, and you look back throughout time, look across cultures, interest rates at 6% is still less than the historical average. We're not talking about interest rates at 6%. Historical average, we're talking 7, 8%, maybe 9%. You go back to the 1970s where we created less liquidity than we've created today. What were interest rates at? 20%. Now the question isn't what are you going to cut? The question is, what government do you have left? This is the concern of our era. This is our charge. And for politicians to tell you that we're not going to touch Medicare, we're not going to touch Medicaid, and we're not going to touch Social Security is to tell you that your children are going to grow up in America where there is less opportunity and less prosperity than the America you inherited. That is not our history, and it is not our tradition. It has not been our tradition since the end of World War II, but it's happening right now in this country. Kids graduating from college now are accepting jobs with less money, and the unemployment rate is higher than the generation before. because of your government, quite frankly. And here's what we hear. We hear these fights over the budget. The budget constitutes 1/3 of federal spending. 2/3 of federal spending is Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. We have taken that 1/3 and we have cut federal spending in that 1/3. That's called discretionary. 2/3 is mandatory. Those are the entitlement programs. And I don't call them entitlement programs because you feel entitled. Some people have tried to pin that on me. That's not the case. They're called entitlement programs because that's what the law calls them, entitlement programs. But instead, we focus on that 1/3 of federal spending that is authorized and appropriated by Congress every year. Half of that 1/3 is defense. You throw in Homeland Security, Veterans Affairs. Now we're talking about a big chunk of that 1/3. That's what we're cutting. Right now, your Department of Defense is being decimated. Over 10 years, we're cutting $1 trillion from the Department of Defense. I'm a Navy pilot. Gabe told you that. I flew in a squadron called VAW 77 up until the day I got elected. In fact, up until the day I got sworn in. Even after I got elected, I was flying missions down in Central America doing counter-drug operations. We busted in that squadron about $2 billion worth of cocaine every year on the high seas. $2 billion. The squadron doesn't exist anymore. That means that cocaine is coming into the country, and the drug cartels are getting the money, destabilizing northern Mexico. And I'm going to start getting into some foreign policy stuff here, and that's not my intent. We're going to wait for the questions. But at the end of the day, friends, we're cutting $1 trillion from defense spending over 10 years. And during that same time, the Russians are investing $750 billion into military modernization. $750 billion. I'm sorry, but you don't invest $750 billion to prevent Poland from invading. What are they investing $750 billion for? Military modernization. Long-range strategic bombers. Basing all over the world. There are negotiations with Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, in our hemisphere for long-range strategic bomber basing. Happening right now. You think about what's happening, $750 billion. I got there January of 2013, and in March we're doing the National Defense Authorization Act. I'm on the Armed Services Committee, and I asked for 2 amendments in the NDAA. One, actually I asked a whole bunch of amendments, but 2 that I want to talk about right now. One, I want a military power report on Russia. Why are they investing $750 billion? And 2, I want an energy security report on NATO. Seems pretty simple request. How can you have allies, NATO allies, that are dependent on Russia for their energy? So I want these 2 reports. March 2013. You would have thought I was opening up the Cold War again. Why are you picking on our friends? Don't you realize they're our partners? Are you trying to destabilize our relationship with Russia? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm asking for a report from the Pentagon. I didn't realize Russia was involved in this. And here's what's interesting. It wasn't too long after that Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, currently occupies Crimea, has destabilized broader eastern Ukraine, and make no mistake, they are occupying eastern Ukraine. It's not just Crimea. And after that happened, my military power report on Russia, the very people who were accusing me of trying to destabilize our relationship with Russia, those people took that bill, they made it a standalone bill, and they passed it. And all it took was for Russia to invade and occupy Crimea. That's the problem in Washington, D.C., quite frankly. They're not concerned so much about the 10-year plan. They're not so concerned about stability and prosperity 10 years from now. They're worried about their next election. And if their next election is not immediately in front of their faces, that's what they're going to focus on. They're going to focus on their next election, and as far as Russia or anything else goes, they'll put that on the back burner until there's a better time. Friends, we've got big problems. And I want to say this. There are solutions. I'm not going to come here and just present a whole bunch of problems. That's not my intent today. I believe that what is right with America can fix what is wrong with America. And I believe that our brighter days are ahead. We still live in the greatest country that God ever placed on this planet, and I do believe God placed it here. I'm gonna finish on this, and then we'll go to questions. You guys have some questions ready to go? Okay, I'll finish on this, and we'll go to questions. Since I mentioned that I do believe that our nation is under God and that it was established by God, as our founding fathers believed. As soon as I got back from the war in Iraq, I was made aware, this was back in 2004, that in the state I was living in, California, it was now unconstitutional to use the words under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. Raise your hand if you remember this, the New Dow case. So I come back from this war in Iraq. It's unconstitutional to use the words of God, the words under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. And so a friend of mine in my squadron was having a birthday, and I went to a birthday party, and there were all kinds of folks there that I didn't know, and one of the people there was a clerk on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Ninth Circuit was the court that just ruled that it was unconstitutional to use the words under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. So I asked this clerk on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals if he was involved in that decision. And he said, not only was I involved, I wrote the decision for the 3-judge panel. And I asked him, I said, how is it unconstitutional to use the words under God in the Pledge of Allegiance? He said, well, it violates separation of church and state. And I asked him, I said, where is that in the Constitution? Well, it's in the First Amendment. And I asked him what the First Amendment said. Well, it says separation of church and state. So I told him that I'm a Navy pilot. I'm sworn to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I said, let me tell you what the First Amendment says. It says, Congress, that's the United States Congress, shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. By the way, this was a Stanford-educated attorney. And I said, based on that, how is it unconstitutional to use the words under God in the Pledge of Allegiance? And he said, well, he got lawyerly. It violates the Establishment Clause. And I said, what religion does under God establish? Does it establish Christianity? Does it establish Judaism? Maybe it establishes Islam. What religion does under God establish? And he said, well, it establishes general deism. And I said, well, if deism is a religion, then you'd also have to argue that its alternate, atheism, is also a religion. And he said, yes, that's correct. He admitted that's correct. And I said, then by your ruling, you have just established our national religion as atheism, which is in itself unconstitutional. And what he said next shocked me. And I know there's a lot of chuckles, but this is dead serious. He said, nobody made that argument. Nobody made that. It wasn't that the argument was made and it failed. Nobody made that argument. And so they removed under God from the Pledge of Allegiance in elementary schools in California. Now, it went to the Supreme Court. There were 8 judges that judged on that case. And in a 5-3 decision, they chose to overturn it. In fact, they didn't overturn it. They said that the father who brought the lawsuit didn't have jurisdiction because he didn't have custody of the child. So in fact, they punted, chose not to hear it, but they said he didn't have standing, and therefore we today have under God in the Pledge of Allegiance in our elementary schools. This is what I think is important for this audience to recognize, that this decision was 5-3. In a country of over 300 million people, it came down to 2. And we wouldn't be using Under God and the Pledge of Allegiance in elementary schools here in Oklahoma. And I'm telling you, as far as I'm concerned, and I've told my kids this, if you're saying the pledge, you say Under God. And you say it loudly.